In the spring of 1944, as Allied commanders prepared for the largest amphibious invasion in history, a decisive part of the plan remained almost invisible. Beyond the maps of Normandy beaches and the carefully rehearsed assault landings, another struggle was unfolding across Britain. It took place in quiet depots, along rail lines, and inside guarded storage yards, far from the attention of headlines or history books. Yet this silent effort would determine whether the invasion could survive beyond its opening hours. The prevailing belief among many was straightforward. D-Day would be won by manpower, by air superiority, and by the sheer scale of the naval armada crossing the Channel. Soldiers would seize the beaches, aircraft would suppress German defenses, and landing craft would deliver wave after wave of reinforcements. These were the visible instruments of victory. Everything else seemed secondary, supporting mechanisms rather than deciding factors. What few openly acknowledged was the irony at the heart of modern warfare. Armies no longer marched on food alone. They moved on fuel. Every tank that rolled inland, every aircraft that loitered overhead, every truck hauling ammunition or wounded men depended on a constant, invisible flow of petrol and oil. Courage could seize ground, but fuel determined whether it could be held. Without it, momentum would evaporate, and with it, the invasion itself. British planners confronted this reality with growing urgency. The coming assault would consume fuel at a scale never before attempted. Millions of gallons would be required in the first days alone. Yet the traditional means of delivery tankers, ports, and overland transport were all dangerously vulnerable. German submarines, air attacks, and the expected destruction of French ports threatened to sever supply lines at the moment they were needed most. The struggle became one of foresight and calculation. Fuel had to be gathered months in advance, stored in secrecy, and prepared for delivery under combat conditions. It was not enough to have reserves. They had to reach the front precisely on time, often before commanders realized they would need them. Logistics became strategy, and strategy became survival. Only later would it be fully understood how close the operation came to collapse before it even began. Without a reliable way to feed the machines of invasion, the landings would have stalled within days. And, as the final preparations for D-Day continued, a quiet solution still doubted by many was taking shape, one that would soon decide whether the invasion lived or died. In early 1944, confidence rested heavily on the visible instruments of power. The Allies possessed overwhelming numbers, command of the air, and a navy unlike anything the world had ever assembled. Months of planning had refined every assault, timetable, and landing sequence. From a distance, D-Day appeared to be a problem already solved, an equation balanced by firepower, experience, and momentum. Victory, it seemed, would be decided on the beaches. Yet beneath this confidence lay a quieter, more dangerous truth. Military might could seize territory, but it could not sustain itself without an uninterrupted flow of supply. And among all supplies, fuel was the most unforgiving. Ammunition could be rationed. Men could endure hunger. But engines, once starved, simply stopped. The shock was not that fuel was needed, but that there was no reliable way to deliver it once the invasion began. The irony was stark. German resistance was only half the battle. The greater threat was collapse from within. An army that outran its fuel became immobile, vulnerable, and predictable. The planners understood that once ashore, the Allied advance would depend on speed, on keeping tanks rolling, trucks moving, aircraft airborne. Any pause would give German forces time to regroup and counterattack. Logistics was no longer support. It was the front line. The struggle became a question without precedent. How could an invading force of millions be kept fueled without functioning ports? Tankers were exposed to submarines and air attack. Temporary harbors might take weeks to operate. Overland pipelines did not exist. Every conventional solution arrived too slowly or broke too easily under enemy pressure. The invasion was ready to move, but its lifeblood had nowhere to flow. Behind closed doors, engineers and planners searched for alternatives that bordered on the unthinkable. The answer would have to bypass ports entirely, evade German detection, and operate continuously under the sea. It was a solution that challenged both physics and convention, and for months it existed only as diagrams, calculations, and doubt. Only when desperation met imagination did the revelation take shape. If fuel could not safely cross the channel on the surface, it would go beneath it. What followed was not merely a logistical adjustment, but a redefinition of how modern war could be sustained quietly, invisibly, and out of sight of the enemy. The solution, when it finally emerged, sounded less like strategy and more like desperation. To sustain the invasion of Europe, Britain would attempt something never before done at such scale: pumping fuel beneath the English Channel. Not by ship, not by port, but through pipelines laid silently on the seabed. It was a plan born not of excess confidence, but of necessity, a recognition that without a constant flow of fuel, the invasion would wither the moment it moved inland. From the beginning, secrecy was absolute. Only a small circle of planners and engineers understood what was being attempted. To the outside world, preparations for D-Day appeared: conventional troops drilling, ships assembling, aircraft filling the skies. Beneath the surface, however, an entirely separate operation was unfolding, one whose success depended on remaining unseen. If discovered, it could be sabotaged before it ever carried a single drop of fuel. The irony was profound. This hidden system, unknown to the public and invisible to most of the military itself, would become one of the invasion's most critical lifelines. While soldiers trained for combat and commanders prepared for battle, fuel would move quietly through steel arteries on the ocean floor. No banners marked its progress. No medals would recognize its builders. Yet without it, tanks would stall, aircraft would be grounded, and advances would grind to a halt. The struggle was relentless. Engineers faced problems that had no ready solutions. The pipelines had to be flexible enough to survive the shifting seabed, strong enough to withstand pressure, and reliable enough to operate continuously under combat conditions. They had to be laid quickly, repaired easily, and kept hidden from enemy patrols. Timing was unforgiving. A delay of days could ripple into disaster weeks later. There was no certainty of success. Early tests failed. Materials broke. Calculations were revised again and again. The entire project hovered between brilliance and catastrophe, its value matched only by its risk. Yet, as the invasion date approached, doubt gave way to resolve. There was no alternative. When the first fuel finally flowed beneath the channel, it did so without ceremony. No announcement marked the moment. But in that quiet achievement, part of D-Day's fate was sealed. Beneath the waves, a network of... In 1944, British engineers and planners confronted a problem that defied conventional military thinking. The invasion of Europe would require an uninterrupted flow of fuel on a scale never before sustained in combat. Tanks, aircraft, trucks, and generators would consume it relentlessly, mile after mile, day after day. The belief was clear: if fuel could not be delivered reliably to the front, no amount of courage or tactical brilliance could compensate. Yet the means to move such vast quantities across a hostile sea simply did not exist, at least not yet. The shock lay in the scale of what was being attempted. This was not a short-term solution or a symbolic gesture. The operation demanded industrial precision under wartime pressure, combining metallurgy, civil engineering, naval coordination, and absolute secrecy. Pipelines would need to stretch across the seabed of the English Channel, endure tides and currents, survive accidental damage, and function continuously once the invasion began. Every failure point carried consequences, measured not in delay, but in lives. There was a deep irony in the effort. While armies trained and fleets assembled in full view of the world, the most decisive element of the invasion remained almost entirely unknown. No headlines followed the engineers working in remote facilities. No speeches celebrated their progress. Their work unfolded in silence. Its success measured only by the absence of disaster. The fuel they delivered would never be seen by the men who depended on it, only felt in the steady hum of engines that did not stop. The struggle tested both ingenuity and resolve. Engineers experimented with new materials, adapting flexible piping originally designed for oil tankers into something capable of resting on the ocean floor. They built massive reels to lay pipe at sea, refined welding techniques under blackout conditions, and planned for repairs in waters that might soon be under enemy fire. Mistakes were costly. Early trials revealed weaknesses that had to be corrected quickly, often without precedent to guide them. Timing was unforgiving. The pipeline had to be ready not months after the landings, but almost immediately. Fuel shortages in the early stages could slow the advance, allowing German forces to regroup and fortify. The margin for error narrowed with every passing day. What had begun as an improbable idea hardened into an operational necessity. There was no alternative plan waiting in reserve. And yet, Against expectation, the impossible began to work. Segment by segment, mile by mile, the system took shape. When fuel finally flowed beneath the channel and into newly liberated France, it did so quietly, without ceremony. But in that steady movement lay the revelation: the invasion could be sustained. What Britain achieved beneath the English Channel bordered on the miraculous. Fuel, volatile, dangerous, and indispensable, was pushed across open water without ships, without ports, and without the enemy ever seeing it move. In wartime conditions, with failure measured in stalled armies and lost lives, the operation demanded precision few believed possible. Yet mile by mile, the Channel floor became the pathway for the energy that would drive the invasion forward. At first, the idea sounded implausible, even reckless. Pumping fuel under the sea was not part of any established military doctrine. Critics questioned whether pipelines could survive tides, pressure, and shifting seabeds, let alone function reliably during combat. But necessity has a way of overriding disbelief. With no secure ports and no safe alternative, what seemed absurd slowly became inevitable. Theory hardened into engineering. Doubt gave way to testing. The irony was unmistakable. This improvised solution, conceived in secrecy and executed without fanfare, would quietly reshape modern warfare. Victory would no longer depend solely on capturing supply routes. It would hinge on creating them from nothing. A war defined by explosions and movement would be sustained by something static, hidden, and methodical. The most revolutionary element of the invasion would not be a weapon, but a system. The struggle to make it work was relentless. Engineers faced constant setbacks as materials failed under pressure and early designs revealed fatal weaknesses. Pipelines had to be flexible, yet durable. Light enough to deploy, yet strong enough to endure months of continuous use. Specialized ships were built to lay pipe at sea, unspooling steel and reinforce tubing while navigating tides and weather that allowed no margin for error. All of it unfolded under the threat of enemy detection. Sabotage and interference were ever-present concerns. A single rupture could halt fuel flow for days. Repairs would have to be made quickly, often under fire, in waters that might soon fall within range of German guns. Every contingency was planned for, yet none could be rehearsed in full. This was engineering conducted in uncertainty, guided as much by intuition as by calculation. And then, almost without notice, it worked. Fuel began to flow from Britain to the continent, steady and uninterrupted. Tanks moved inland. Aircraft remained airborne. The advance did not pause. What made this possible remained unseen by the men it sustained. Buried beneath water and silence, there were no markers, no visible signs of success, only the absence of failure. In the end, the infrastructure that allowed D-Day to endure was nearly invisible. But it was there, pulsing quietly beneath the Channel, turning an invasion into a campaign. And as Allied forces pushed deeper into Europe, that hidden lifeline would prove that modern war was no longer won only by what could be seen, but by what could endure unseen. In the planning rooms of 1944, attention naturally gravitated toward the visible instruments of war: infantry strength, armored divisions, naval firepower, and air superiority dominated discussion. These were the measures by which battles had always been judged, and D-Day was no exception. Success, it was believed, would come from overwhelming force applied at precisely the right moment. Logistics existed to support that force, not to define it. The shock came only when planners confronted what victory would require after the beaches were taken. An invasion does not end when soldiers land. It begins there. Every mile inland multiplied demand. Tanks burned fuel at astonishing rates. Aircraft required constant refueling to maintain air cover. Trucks moved endlessly between depots in the front, and unlike ammunition or manpower, fuel could not be delayed. When it stopped, everything else stopped with it. The irony was unavoidable. The most decisive element of the entire operation was not a weapon, a general, or a battle plan, but a pipeline resting silently beneath the sea. This reliance marked a turning point in warfare. Modern armies would no longer be judged solely by their ability to fight, but by their capacity to sustain motion. Logistics ceased to be a background concern and became a strategic weapon in its own right. Keeping that weapon operational was a race against time. As Allied forces pushed inland, demand surged beyond initial estimates. The pipeline had to function continuously, under pressure, without interruption. Damage had to be repaired quickly. Pumping stations had to keep pace with advancing units. All of it occurred while the enemy fought desperately to slow the advance, targeting roads, bridges, and supply hubs whenever possible. The margin for failure narrowed with every passing day. Weather compounded the strain. Rough seas disrupted surface transport, making the pipeline even more critical. Any delay threatened to create gaps that German forces could exploit. Commanders soon understood that their freedom to maneuver depended less on enemy resistance than on the steady flow of fuel beneath the channel. The battlefield had expanded beyond land and air into the realm of infrastructure. The revelation was unmistakable. Against all odds, the system held. Fuel continued to arrive. Engines continued to run. The Allied advance did not stall. What had begun as an improvised solution became the foundation of sustained momentum across France and beyond. The invasion succeeded not because it struck hard once, but because it could keep moving afterward. In the end, the true secret weapon of D-Day was never seen by those who fought. It lay hidden beneath the sea, indifferent to gunfire and glory alike. And as Europe was slowly liberated, it became clear that modern war would be. As June 1944 approached, pressure mounted across every layer of the invasion effort. On the surface, attention fixed itself on the men who would storm the beaches, infantry units, rehearsing landings, naval crews, memorizing fire plans, pilots studying targets along the French coast. Yet beneath this visible preparation, another group carried a different burden. Engineers, technicians, and logistics officers watched gauges, charts, and flow rates, knowing that the success of the landings would mean little if fuel failed to arrive afterward. What had once been considered a secure and carefully hidden operation now entered its most dangerous phase. Secrecy had protected the pipeline during its construction, but once the invasion began, concealment would no longer be enough. The flow of fuel had to increase precisely as enemy activity intensified. German artillery, air attacks, and naval patrols did not need to find the pipeline itself. Disrupting pumping stations, depots, or connecting infrastructure could be enough to cripple the system. The irony was sharp. The more successful the invasion became, the more exposed its lifeline grew. The threat was constant, even when unseen. Every vibration in the line, every fluctuation in pressure raised the possibility of damage. A rupture beneath the channel could not be fixed quickly or easily. Repairs would require specialized crews, dangerous conditions, and precious time the advancing armies did not have. The pipeline had been designed to endure, but it had never been tested under the full weight of war. Now, it would be. As Allied forces fought to secure the beaches and push inland, demand surged beyond initial projections. Tanks moved farther each day. Aircraft flew longer missions. Supply convoys multiplied. Fuel consumption climbed relentlessly, and the pipeline was expected to keep pace without pause. There was no reserve switch to flip, no alternate route waiting in readiness. If the flow stopped, the advance would slow. If the advance slowed, the Germans would regain their footing. Enemy pressure only deepened the strain. Bombing raids targeted ports and transport hubs. Roads and bridges were destroyed as quickly as engineers could repair them. Surface supply routes became unreliable, reinforcing the pipeline's importance even as they increased its vulnerability. The system was no longer a contingency. It was the backbone of the campaign, carrying a responsibility few outside the logistics chain fully understood. Those managing the fuel flow worked without the clarity of a battlefield. There were no visible victories, only numbers that had to remain stable. Their success was measured by silence, by the absence of alarms, shortages, and delays. Each hour the fuel continued to move was an hour the invasion remained alive. Each failure, however small, threatened consequences far beyond its point of origin. Gradually, a truth became impossible to ignore. The fate of the armies in France was bound to a thin line beneath the sea. Ensuring that fuel reached the front was not secondary to combat, it was inseparable from it. The battle was being fought simultaneously on beaches, in the air, and within valves and pipes that few soldiers would ever see. As D-Day gave way to sustained operations, the pipeline endured. It bent but did not break. Fuel flowed, engines ran, and momentum held. The revelation was clear to those watching closely. By the summer of 1944, the pipes beneath the English Channel were operating under conditions few engineers would have believed survivable. Fuel moved steadily through steel and reinforced tubing, pushed by pressure alone. crossing a hostile sea without escort or armor. Above, the invasion unfolded in fire and motion. Below, the lifeline endured. Its success was measured not in spectacle, but in continuity. As long as the fuel flowed, the invasion lived. To most observers, the outcome of D-Day appeared to hinge on familiar elements of war. Air superiority strangled German movement. Infantry seized ground yard by yard. Armor pushed inland, forcing retreats and counterattacks. These were the visible forces shaping history. Yet each depended on a quieter force beneath them. Aircraft required constant refueling. Tanks burned through reserves in hours. Trucks carried the weight of the advance on engines that could not pause. What kept everything in motion was not strategy alone, but supply. The irony was almost complete. One of the most decisive factors in the campaign was invisible not only to the public, but to many of the soldiers it sustained. The pipeline had no emblem, no sound, no presence on the battlefield. It left no photographs and inspired no headlines. And yet, without it, the momentum gained on the beaches would have dissipated within days. Victory would have slowed into stalemate, then vulnerability. The struggle to keep the system alive never eased. Any disruption, however, brief carried consequences that multiplied rapidly at the front. A pressure drop could idle vehicles miles away. A delay in pumping could ground aircraft scheduled to provide cover. Repairs beneath the sea were slow and dangerous, conducted under conditions that allowed no improvisation. Each problem demanded a solution before its effects became visible, because by then it would already be too late. As Allied forces pushed deeper into France, the demands placed on the pipeline grew heavier. Distance increased consumption. Speed amplified risk. The farther the front advanced, the more critical uninterrupted fuel delivery became. Surface supply routes remained fragile, subject to weather and enemy action. Again and again, it was the pipeline that absorbed the strain, compensating for disruption elsewhere by simply continuing to function. Those responsible for managing the flow lived in a constant state of anticipation. There were no clear moments of relief, only brief confirmations that the system still held. Their war was fought in numbers and margins, in flow rates and pressure tolerances. Success meant invisibility. Failure would announce itself immediately. Installed columns and silent engines. Gradually, a deeper realization emerged among planners and commanders alike. The battle under the sea was not secondary to the fighting on land. It was inseparable from it. The invasion's success depended as much on endurance as on shock. And endurance in modern war belonged to those who could sustain motion longer than their enemy. The pipeline did not win battles, but it made winning possible. In time, historians would note how rarely this lifeline appeared in official accounts. The beaches dominated memory. The battles defined narratives. The infrastructure beneath the channel. From the moment Allied forces set foot in Normandy, the invasion entered a phase where movement mattered more than spectacle. Armies that could not move could not exploit success, and victories that could not be sustained quickly dissolved into stalemate. Tanks required constant refueling to keep pace with the advance. Aircraft demanded uninterrupted supplies to maintain air cover. Trucks, ambulances, and engineering vehicles consumed fuel as relentlessly as ammunition. Without it, the vast machinery of liberation would seize up not gradually, but abruptly. The struggle was absolute in its simplicity. An empty fuel tank ended a battle before it began. Armor stalled in open fields. Aircraft remained grounded while opportunities slipped away. Supply convoys backed up behind silent engines. The Allies had learned these lessons earlier in the war, often at great cost. Now, on the beaches of France, there would be no margin for error. Momentum was everything, and momentum ran on fuel. Yet the irony of this dependence was unmistakable. History would remember D-Day through images of soldiers charging ashore, of paratroopers scattered across hedgerows, of cities liberated after brutal fighting. The supply line that made all of it possible remained largely invisible. There were no photographs of fuel moving beneath the channel, no dramatic footage of pipelines at work. The quiet efficiency that sustained the advance was overshadowed by the violence it enabled. Maintaining that flow became a constant pressure, one that never eased as the campaign progressed. German forces, though retreating, continued to target supply routes whenever possible. Roads were cratered, bridges destroyed. Weather disrupted surface transport. Each disruption increased reliance on the unseen system beneath the sea. The pipeline was expected to compensate for every setback. to deliver without pause while the war above it remained unpredictable. Those responsible for managing fuel supplies understood the fragility of the balance. Consumption rose faster than forecasts. Front lines shifted daily. Repairs had to be made before shortages became visible. A single delay could ripple outward, affecting operations miles away. The work demanded anticipation rather than reaction, discipline rather than improvisation. It was a battle fought against time and uncertainty, with no room for recognition. Gradually, the revelation became unavoidable. Fuel was not merely a supporting resource, it was a strategic partner in every success that followed D-Day. It allowed the Allies to press forward when resistance weakened. It prevented pauses that could have allowed German forces to regroup. It transformed isolated victories into continuous advance. Where fuel flowed, movement followed. Where movement endured, liberation advanced. And still, the fuel itself remained uncelebrated. Soldiers knew only that their vehicles ran when needed. Pilots trusted that ground crews would refuel their aircraft. Commanders issued orders confident that engines would respond. The system worked precisely because it was unnoticed. Its greatest achievement was the absence of failure. In the end, fuel proved to be one of the war's. By the late summer of 1944, the invasion of Western Europe had entered a decisive phase. What had begun with uncertainty and fragile footholds now carried a sense of momentum that proved difficult to reverse. Despite storms, enemy resistance, and the relentless strain of continuous operations, the fuel kept coming. Day after day, beneath the English Channel, the pipeline delivered without pause. It did not accelerate the war with drama or spectacle, but it refused to let it slow. This continuity was the shock few had anticipated. Every prior assumption suggested that something would fail under such pressure. Weather would intervene. Enemy action would disrupt the system. Materials would fatigue. Yet the flow endured. While commanders prepared for shortages that never came, engines continued to turn over, aircraft continued to lift into the sky, and armored columns continued their advance. The invasion, once precarious, became self-sustaining. The irony was complete. History would remember D-Day for the violence of its opening hours, for the courage displayed on exposed beaches. But the deeper story of success unfolded far from gunfire. Beneath the sea, in darkness and pressure, another battle had already been won. No territory was captured there. No enemy surrendered. Yet it was this unseen struggle that allowed every visible victory to follow. As weeks passed, Allied forces began to feel the difference. Advances no longer paused for fuel. Commanders planned operations with confidence that supply would meet ambition. The fear of overextension, the great killer of offensives, began to recede. Where hesitation once dictated caution, assurance now permitted speed. The front moved not in bursts, but in steady motion. This was the turning point logistics had promised, but never before delivered so completely. The pipeline allowed the Allies to convert tactical success into strategic advantage. German defenses, already strained, could not recover fast enough. Counterattacks arrived late or under strength. Retreats became routes. Each mile gained widened the gap between Allied capability and German response. Fuel, invisible and constant, widened that gap with every hour. The transformation was subtle but decisive. War had always depended on supply, but rarely had it demonstrated this truth so clearly. Firepower mattered. Courage mattered. Leadership mattered, yet none of it could function without endurance, and endurance belonged to the side that could sustain motion longer than its enemy. The pipeline beneath the channel made that endurance possible. By autumn, the results were undeniable. Allied forces had broken out of Normandy, liberated Paris, and driven toward Germany's borders. The invasion had become a campaign. The campaign, a continental advance. At no point did fuel shortages dictate the pace. What had once been a calculated risk had become a quiet certainty. The system held not because it was invulnerable, but because it had been built to endure pressure rather than avoid it. The revelation, when fully understood, altered the meaning of victory itself. The war had not turned solely because of superior weapons or larger armies. It had turned because the Allies learned how to sustain success once achieved. Logistics ceased to be an afterthought and emerged as a decisive force. The pipeline did not win battles, but it ensured that victories accumulated instead of dissipating. In retrospect, the outcome seems inevitable. At the time, it was anything but. From the earliest planning stages, Allied commanders understood a hard truth. Without fuel, the advance across France would collapse under its own weight. Armies could fight for days without reinforcements, but they could not move without energy. Tanks, trucks, artillery tractors, and aircraft all shared the same dependency. If fuel failed to arrive in sufficient quantity, the invasion would slow, then stall, and finally become vulnerable to counterattack. Belief in victory rested not only on seizing the beaches, but on sustaining movement beyond them. That belief was tested almost immediately. The scale of fuel consumption exceeded even the most conservative estimates. Units pushed inland faster than expected, increasing demand while ports remained unusable and roads lay in ruins. Every mile gained multiplied the strain. The shock was not that shortages threatened, but how close they came to materializing. At several points, the margin between supply and paralysis narrowed to hours rather than days. The irony of survival lay in its simplicity. While the greatest amphibious assault in history unfolded above the water, its endurance depended on something few could see and fewer still discussed. Beneath the English Channel, fuel continued to move through steel arteries laid in secrecy months earlier. No battle reports mentioned it. No victory announcements credited it. Yet this quiet operation proved more decisive than many actions fought in full view. With each passing day, the pipeline shifted the balance. It allowed the Allies to maintain pressure when hesitation would have been fatal. Tanks rolled without waiting for tanker convoys. Aircraft sorties continued without interruption. Engineers repaired bridges and roads, knowing that fuel would arrive when needed. What had once been a calculated risk became a stabilizing force, anchoring the invasion against uncertainty. This marked the true turning point of the campaign. As fuel flowed steadily, Allied forces consolidated their positions on the beaches and expanded outward. German attempts to contain the invasion faltered, as counterattacks arrived piecemeal and under-resourced. The enemy could still fight, but could no longer dictate tempo. That privilege now belonged to the side that could sustain momentum, and momentum belonged to those with fuel. The pipeline did more than prevent collapse. It enabled ambition. Commanders began to plan deeper advances, confident that supply would not dictate restraint. The fear of overextension, which had haunted earlier campaigns, loosened its grip. Logistics no longer followed success at a distance. It moved with it, shaping operations in real time. The invasion matured from a fragile foothold into a platform for liberation. The revelation, once recognized, reframed the entire operation. The battle for Normandy was not only a contest of firepower and bravery, but of endurance and foresight. Control of land mattered, but control of energy mattered just as much. The pipeline beneath the sea represented a new dimension of warfare, where victory depended on sustaining motion rather than delivering a single decisive blow. In the end, D-Day did not collapse because the Allies solved a problem their enemy never fully understood. They secured the battle for fuel before the first landing craft touched shore. The pipes beneath the channel carried more than petrol, they carried continuity. And in modern war, continuity is often the difference between a bold plan and a lasting victory. As the front moved steadily eastward, one truth became clear to those who studied the campaign closely. The greatest danger had not been German resistance alone, but the possibility of running dry. That danger was defeated quietly. When the beaches of Normandy finally fell silent and the front lines pushed eastward, the pipeline beneath the English Channel did not retire with the headlines. It continued to operate long after the shock of D-Day had passed, quietly supplying fuel as Allied forces advanced across France. What had been conceived as a solution for invasion proved essential for occupation, pursuit, and liberation. The war moved forward, and beneath it, the fuel kept flowing. This persistence was its first and greatest revelation. The pipeline was never meant to be a momentary triumph. It was built for endurance. As ports slowly came back into service and supply routes expanded, demand did not ease, it increased. Distance consumed fuel as surely as combat did. Tanks rolled farther. Aircraft flew deeper missions. The farther the Allies advanced, the more essential uninterrupted supply became. What had saved the invasion now sustained the campaign. And yet, the irony of its importance endured. Public memory would fix itself on the beaches, the battles, and the cities reclaimed. The infrastructure that enabled those victories remained largely absent from official histories and popular imagination. There were no monuments to the pipeline, no parades for the engineers who designed and maintained it, Its success ensured its anonymity. It worked too well to be noticed. For military planners, however, its impact was unmistakable. The pipeline demonstrated that logistics could be proactive rather than reactive, that supply systems could be designed not merely to follow armies, but to shape their possibilities. This marked a turning point in modern warfare. Future campaigns would no longer treat fuel and infrastructure as secondary concerns. They would be central to operational planning from the outset. The lessons extended far beyond the Second World War. Post-war militaries studied the pipeline not as an improvisation, but as a proof of concept. It showed that innovation and logistics could achieve what force alone could not. Speed, flexibility, and endurance became the new measures of power. The ability to sustain motion mattered as much as the ability to seize ground. Modern war would be fought as much in engineering offices as on battlefields. The deeper revelation lay in how completely the pipeline altered the meaning of victory. D-Day is remembered as a triumph of courage and coordination, and rightly so. But beneath those achievements lay a foundation that rarely enters the narrative. The invasion succeeded not because it struck once with overwhelming force, but because it could continue moving afterward. The pipeline transformed a bold gamble into a lasting campaign. In this sense, the legacy of D-Day extends far beyond Normandy. It resides in the recognition that unseen systems often decide visible outcomes, that wars are won not only by those who fight, but by those who ensure fighting can continue. The pipeline beneath the channel embodied that truth with quiet efficiency. As decades passed and memory softened the sharp edges of the conflict, the pipes rusted and the stations fell silent. But their influence remained. Every modern military operation that prioritizes logistics over spectacle carries the imprint of that wartime decision. Every campaign planned around sustainment rather than surprise echoes the lesson learned in 1944. The final irony is perhaps the most enduring. The pipeline was designed to disappear to be unseen by enemy and ally alike. In doing so, it shaped the course of a war and the future of warfare itself. D-Day's lasting legacy is not only the landings that changed Europe, but the silent infrastructure that made those landings matter. To understand the true significance of the pipeline beneath the English Channel, one must consider the alternative. Without it, the invasion of Normandy would have entered its most dangerous phase within days of landing. Fuel shortages would not have announced themselves with explosions or warnings. They would have arrived quietly, first as delays, then as hesitation, and finally as paralysis. In modern war, such pauses are fatal. The consequence would have been measured not only in lost ground, but in lost lives. An advance deprived of fuel becomes predictable. Tanks stall where they stand. Aircraft remain grounded while the enemy regroups. Supply convoys clog narrow roads, waiting for engines that will not turn over. German forces, given time and space, would have counterattacked with renewed strength. Every hour of delay would have multiplied risk. What began as a bold foothold could have collapsed into a costly stalemate, fought at the water's edge. The human cost of such failure would have been staggering. Units stranded without mobility would have faced encirclement. Air cover, reduced by fuel scarcity, would have left troops exposed. Casualties would have risen not because of inferior tactics or courage, but because the means to sustain momentum had failed. The irony is sharp. Lives would have been lost not to enemy fire alone, but to absence, to empty tanks and silent engines. In this light, the pipeline emerges not as a technical curiosity, but as a decisive intervention. What could have been a forgotten experiment became a turning point precisely because it worked. Its success denied the enemy the opportunity to exploit Allied vulnerability. By removing fuel as a limiting factor, it allowed commanders to focus on maneuver rather than survival. The war did not hinge on a single battle, but on the ability to avoid catastrophe in its aftermath. The revelation extends beyond Normandy. Logistics, often relegated to the background of military history, proved capable of shaping outcomes as decisively as strategy or firepower. The pipeline demonstrated that wars are not won solely by those who fight well, but by those who prepare for endurance. It shifted the balance from momentary success to sustained pressure, a difference that defines victory. Had the system failed, history might remember D-Day not as the beginning of liberation, but as a costly gamble that stalled at the coastline. Political resolve would have been tested, resources would have been diverted. The war in Western Europe could have dragged on longer, at greater cost, with consequences reaching far beyond France. The margin between success and failure was narrower than memory often admits. Instead, failure was quietly defeated. not on the beaches, but beneath the sea. The pipeline ensured that the invasion did not merely survive its first shock, but absorbed it and moved forward. Its achievement lay not in drama, but in prevention, in ensuring that the worst outcomes never materialized. The final irony is that this decisive factor remains largely absent from popular memory. Yet its absence from history books does not diminish its impact. The cost of failure was avoided precisely because the system worked as intended, and in that avoidance lies its greatest legacy. Logistics rarely earns recognition because its triumphs leave no scars. But in 1944, it determined whether courage would be rewarded or squandered. The pipeline beneath the channel stands as a reminder that, in war as in history, the difference between disaster and victory often depends on what happens out of sight. Behind the diagrams, calculations, and steel laid beneath the channel stood people whose war was fought far from the beaches of Normandy. They were engineers, technicians, welders, naval crews, and logistics officers, many too old, too specialized, or too essential to be sent ashore with a rifle. Their battlefield was measured in pressure tolerances and flow rates, in deadlines that could not slip, and systems that could not fail. They understood, often more clearly than anyone else, that the invasion depended as much on their work as on the men storming the coast. For many of them, the task carried a peculiar weight. They knew they were building something that could not be tested in advance, something that would either work under the worst possible conditions or collapse when it was needed most. Mistakes would not announce themselves immediately. Failure would travel quietly down the line, into engines, into stalled advances. The responsibility was absolute, and there would be no moment of glory to offset it. The irony of their role was evident even then. While soldiers trained under the scrutiny of cameras and commanders, the people behind the pipeline worked in obscurity. Their progress was classified, their successes invisible. Even among the military, few fully understood what they were doing or why it mattered. They labored knowing that if everything went well, no one would ever notice. Recognition was not expected and could not be afforded. The human cost of this quiet operation was real. Long hours were spent under blackout conditions, in cold workshops and coastal installations vulnerable to air attack. Sea crews laid pipe in dangerous waters, often at night, navigating tides and weather that allowed no margin for error. Repairs were conducted under pressure, both mechanical and psychological, because every delay carried consequences felt miles away. Fatigue was constant. Failure was unthinkable. Some later recalled the strange distance from the war's violence. They heard about the landings over radios, knowing that fuel was already moving beneath the water. They watched maps change, while gauges remained steady. Their anxiety did not peak during battles, but during silence, when a pressure reading dipped or a flow rate hesitated. For them, victory was not a captured town, but a system that continued to function. In hindsight, many struggled to articulate their contribution. They had not faced enemy fire directly, yet they carried a burden just as heavy. The revelation came slowly, often years later, as histories emerged and connections became clear. The advance across France, the speed of liberation, the absence of catastrophic pauses, all traced back, in part, to their work. What they had built did not fight the war, but it made fighting possible. The deepest irony is that their sacrifices blended seamlessly into success. There were no medals for uninterrupted fuel flow, no citations for problems that never occurred. The pipeline's triumph was measured in the absence of disaster, and absence rarely earns remembrance. Yet, without the discipline, ingenuity, and endurance of these individuals, courage on the beaches might have been squandered by failure inland. Their story reminds us that war is not sustained by heroism alone. It is sustained by people willing to accept responsibility without recognition, to work in silence so others can advance in noise and fire. The battle for fuel demanded patience rather than aggression, precision. History often fixes its gaze on moments of impact. The opening ramps, the first shots, the beaches under fire. D-Day has endured in memory as a single, violent crossing between preparation and sacrifice. Yet that moment, as decisive as it was, did not win the campaign that followed. What mattered just as much was what happened after the landings, when the smoke cleared, the tide went out, and the real test of endurance began. An invasion is not a victory in itself. It is an opening argument. Once ashore, armies must move, adapt, and sustain pressure faster than the enemy can recover. On the 6th of June, 1944, the Allies achieved the impossible by gaining a foothold in Normandy. But the greater danger came afterward. Without the ability to reinforce, resupply, and advance, that foothold could have collapsed under counterattack. History remembers courage on the beaches. It less often remembers what kept that courage from being wasted. The moral truth of D-Day lies here. War is not decided by a single act of bravery, but by continuity, the ability to keep going when the initial shock has passed. Tanks that cannot move become targets. Aircraft without fuel become symbols rather than weapons. Momentum, once lost, is rarely recovered. The Allies understood this, even if the world did not see it. They knew that the landing was only the beginning. Beneath the English Channel, an unseen effort ensured the beginning did not become an ending. Fuel flowed steadily, indifferent to tides, weather, and headlines. It did not inspire speeches or photographs. It simply did its work. That work allowed machines to keep running, plans to remain flexible, and commanders to think beyond survival toward opportunity. The invasion lived because it was sustained. This is where D-Day becomes something larger than a landing. It becomes a lesson in modern conflict. Logistics, often dismissed as mundane, proved itself to be the silent partner in victory. Not glamorous, not dramatic, but decisive. The pipeline beneath the sea represented a shift in how wars are won. Success no longer belonged only to those who struck hardest, but to those who could endure longest. The people who built and maintained that system understood its importance long before history caught up. They worked without applause, often without certainty, knowing that failure would never announce itself cleanly. Their reward was invisibility. If the fuel flowed, no one would ask why. If it stopped, everything else would unravel. They accepted that burden without expectation of recognition. In this sense, D-Day challenges how we measure heroism. Courage on the battlefield is unmistakable and deserves remembrance. But there is another kind of courage, the willingness to take responsibility for outcomes that will never bear your name. The engineers, planners, and technicians behind the fuel supply carried that weight quietly. They ensured that sacrifice led somewhere meaningful. As the Allied advance rolled eastward, liberated cities became symbols of success. Yet each mile gained